Let me summarize what you've said so far. So you're not suggesting that the adaptive arguments are necessarily wrong. You're saying that if they are true, they hold for the version of more modern instantiations of religions. But if we go to the religious expression as typically expressed in our ancestral environments, then the adaptive argument breaks down. Is that a succinct
I
summary?
think so. I think so, and that's what makes the position sometimes a bit ambiguous in the sense that people like who work on these ideas of religions as promoting pro-social behavior, like Ara Norenzayan or Azim Sharif, they would say that yes, those religions were good for the building of large-scale societies,
Right.
and they don't want to project that onto the ancestral past. So they see it as a sort of social gadget that we found that makes it possible to have large-scale societies. I'm not sure that's true, but I think that's a sound argument in the sense that it does not project religion onto ancestral paths where it didn't actually exist in the form we know. But you know that's. But I must say, I stopped working on religion many years ago. I was dragged back into it, you know, kicking and screaming several times because people would say horrendous things about what I said. But very often, very soon after I published that book, I thought I should get out because the reactions of the book were of two kinds. Some people telling me, you're entirely right, and that is why we have religion, and it's beautiful and great. And some people saying you're entirely right, and that's why religion is nonsense, and we should get rid of it. And you know, people saying that I was wrong for exactly those same reasons.
Right.
So the best comment I got was I gave a talk at some religious studies conference, which was mostly religious folks, and someone told me afterwards I gave my story about byproducts and people having a notion of gods and spirits because they have a theory of mind and they project that and so on. And someone told me, well, I think you're entirely right. And what you said is true. And I thought, well, true. I mean, I would say maybe it's sort of, you know, like an academic or a scientist. It takes us a bit closer to what might be a possibly valid approximation of a model. So no, it's true. And that's why God gave us the Bible the way he did, because he knew it would work. So
Nice.
as an epistemic credential, you know, I'm approved by God himself. So,
Being approved by God is almost as good as being approved by God. Uh,
so now I'm working towards the higher good of being approved by God's art.
there you go. Let me ask you this. Maybe this is too simplistic, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Is it not true that if we ultimately didn't suffer from having the meta realization of our looming mortality, that
Mhm.
this whole discussion of religion would never have arisen? In other words, the most fundamental thing that religion does, irrespective of which instantiation it is, irrespective of whether it is EEA bound or it is more modern, is that it offers me a solution to a problem that I really, really detest. I mean, I'm sitting here with the lovely Pascal Boyer. We're having a chat, but you're telling me that in 40 years this party is going to end? I don't like this. I want this party to go on forever. Well, I have one of two options at that point. I could either believe in something that someone is offering me that really sounds as though it could solve this problem for me, or I could take the much darker option and to believe that the party is going to end, at least for you, while the
Yeah.
rest of the folks go on partying. So isn't the bottom line is that we have a realization of our mortality while other sentient beings don't?
Well, the thing is that first of all, I don't think in these kind of cultural phenomena you ever have a bottom line in this sense that even if this factor, and I tell you what I think about that, is very important, then what we get in terms of religious beliefs and behaviors is a huge amount of beliefs, rituals, and things like that. They do not derive from that original need, even if it was there. They do not derive from there. They derive from the fact that they are relevant in the sense that people pay attention to them and can store them and transmit them to others more easily than other things. But this being said, about the mortality thing, yes, as you know, there's a whole school of psychology that tried to see what the effects of mortality were, mortality salience people, and they found all sorts of effects there, and I think there are effects there, but they're often things that that could be explained in a simpler way than just saying that people are terribly worried about their mortality. But let's accept that they are, and that it's a worrying thing. I think it's also a worrying prospect because we don't have the cognitive means of thinking about it. So that's something I tried to talk about, but that was very speculative in the religion book, which was that we have an sort of intuitive psychology and social psychology mechanisms in the mind that give us a certain idea of who people are and how we interact with them. We also have animacy and intuitive biology mechanisms. Okay, so on the one hand, I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to you as Gad, someone who I know has a certain personality, I suppose, or a certain set of ideas and a relationship with me and other people and so on. This is all the social stuff. But I also know that you have a physical body, that you need food, that you were probably born of someone of the same species as me, and that kind of thing. That you're made of meat, all these things. Now, this latter kind of biological system has no difficulty in coping with death. Psychologists used to think that children cannot think about death, and then anthropologists like Clark Barrett showed that no, they're perfectly fine thinking about the termination of life. If you think of it in terms of predation, once the zebra has been cut in two by the tiger, then the zebra doesn't have any independent motion or physiology or stuff like that. Children are perfectly happy with that, and we are happy with that. We're not happy, but we cognitively, we can apprehend that very easily. On the other hand, there is no sort of endpoint for our social cognition. So, and, I have a social interaction of a kind with my father who died 20 years ago. We all have some kind of emotional, but also cognitive kind of interaction with people who are not around. We think in terms of counterfactuals. What will they think if I do this, but the person is not around? So I think we have a way of extending people's life beyond their physical presence that clashes with our intuitive biology. So when you have a corpse, you have this example of someone who, one of your systems, as it were, or some of your systems say, well, this is finished, this person is not person anymore. But other systems say, no, it's the person. I still have feelings for her or for him. I still have memories. We still have interaction. This person is still my uncle if he's dead. It doesn't erase the fact that he's my uncle, and so on and so forth. So that, I think, creates a kind of discrepancy or dissonance that may also make lots of religious constructions about ancestors and things like that very, very salient.
Do you think that, and I actually wrote once a popular like a Psychology Today article where I was explaining that there are two paths to immortality that don't require religion. And I was arguing for, of course, genetic reproductive fitness and mimetic fitness, right? So I was basically saying, by you and I having children, we are literally in some form becoming immortal. And then, of course, by creating things, this conversation, in a sense, immortalizes us, right? The books that you've written, the ideas that you've had, the good deeds that you've done that have been passed on to others. So when people are often concerned about their legacy, in a sense, they are expressing a form of need, without getting too psychoanalytical, to wish to remain immortal. Do you think that part of our, desire to be ambitious and produce really stems from a desire to quell this mortality angst?
That may be the case. I'm not sure about that, because I tell you very frankly, I haven't really thought about it in any sort of detail, and I don't think that we have very good evidence for this angst, beyond the fact that, yes, of course, if we think about it, we have this this introspective kind of feeling that it is anxiety provoking. But it seems to be that the reason we do science is a beautiful example of the way we can, some institutions can hijack all sorts of motivations from the most noble to the most sordid in the service of the greater good. So, we publish articles because we're really interested in finding out how things work, but also because we want to show other people how smart we are. And we certainly sign these articles because we don't want other people to take credit for what little bit of, smart stuff we've found. So it may be also that we recruit this sort of idea that there has to be some way in which I'm left a trace. Right. For these things. The sad thing is that there are many ways to achieve immortality, mimetic immortality, or even worse things, sort of immortality in the sense that you affected so many people by being a horrible dictator, sort of demagogue, and so on and so forth. These things are very require in a way less cognitive work than doing science, but they're more likely to have an effect. Stalin does, remain.
I think he was recently voted in some survey as the #1 most remarkable person, and I think it was some Russian survey.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks to your point. Of course, Genghis Khan didn't engage in mimetic fitness. He actually engaged in reproductive fitness because wasn't there a study that showed that some unbelievable number of descendants stem from Genghis Khan in some way or another?
Basically, you and I, Gad, are very, very likely to be descendants of Genghis Khan in some way. This is, I don't know to what extent that's the case for either of us, but it's true that mimetic descendants or sort of effects is also something that's very, I think, very closely linked to ancestral motivations. Like, in any small-scale group, you'll see that there is a kind of cognitive division of labor. That some people are the more competent people, some people are wiser, some people are funnier, some people know lots of stories, and some people are more helpful, some people are more decisive, and you get this sort of cognitive division. So, but what matters to lots of people is to find the ways in which they can have a niche. Right. In this sort of small group mentality. That is why the modern world is of course very stressful, because you cannot be as clever as those famous physicists. You can't be as good looking as those famous actors. You can't be, there are exceptions, of course, like Saad, but
well, the check is in the mail.
But we can't, we're constantly bombarded with those these extraordinary outliers, and that may frustrate our sort of sense that in my little environment I am the funniest one, or I am the competent one, or I am so and so. And I'm not saying that it erases that sense, but it may sort of compromise it, and that might be really stressful.
What you spoke about with these different niches is something that I recently covered in a Sad Truth, which actually stemmed from another commentary I had done on another Target article in European Journal of Personality, I think. It was a paper on the evolutionary genetics of personality. And in the Sad Truth, I was talking about the question that I pose is, why does evolution maintain heterogeneous personality types? And of course, the argument is that there are no selection pressures for evolution to sort of converge on one optimal personality cluster, because precisely as you said, in different niches, different characters would be optimal. In the same way that in an organizational culture, you got the Google culture, you've got the Wall Street culture, the exact same individual will either flourish or flounder in either culture. So that exactly speaks to that idea, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is another sort of domain where I think that evolutionary psychology could at some point flourish, and that would be the intersection between genetics personality and sort of evolutionary constraints on division of labor and division of cognitive labor and things like that. But we don't have much because, of course, personality psychology is not actually, at the level that we would wish. Even personality psychologists sort of know that. And the genetics of personality is still in its infancy. So, but that is certainly a really interesting sort of, way of saying variation among humans is sometimes something that is preserved through evolution because of those diverse environments and niches in possible environments.
And I think an interesting point when we're talking about not only individual differences, but cultural differences, is the fact that most people don't appreciate that evolutionary scientists are interested in these differences. They typically think that evolutionary psychologists are largely interested in human universals, whilst not realizing that the evolutionary lens is perfectly appropriate. I mean, you study cultural transmission, right? So you could study culture and cultural differences from an evolutionary perspective. You could study why Pascal and Gad and individual differences express themselves from an evolutionary perspective. And I think most people, including many of our sophisticated colleagues, don't appreciate that point.
No, and I think it's partly it's partly our fault. I mean, in terms of first of all, there's a tendency for especially early evolutionary psychology to say, well, we're talking about human universals, and that of course is interesting because this is something that there's so much of a sort of academic culture in the social sciences that's been trying to say that everything is different in every human culture and so on and so forth, that you had to go against that. However, it's true that lots and lots of things that for example, that I study, that you study, are things that you cannot just ascribe to, describe in terms of human universals. There are places where people do not do mass consumption simply because there's no production. So, they don't consume. And there are places where people consume very differently because they're offered different kinds of things in different environments. Now, in the same way, it seems to me that once you have a set of ideas that make religious concepts salient, easy to acquire and to transmit and so on, and compelling as well, then you get all sorts of potential differences depending on what other aspects of the culture are there. Now, I think early evolutionary psychology tended to, especially in its popular version, not in the scientific version, but it's in popular instantiations, it tended to focus on universals and, of course, on sex and violence, which gave this sort of idea that, well, it's all about, people beating up and raping each other and stuff like that, and that's what it's all about. But it's not about sophisticated cognitive things, including cultural institutions that could be different from place to place. John Tooby and Lila Cosmides tried very hard to include all sorts of things of that kind when they explained their original ideas for an evolutionary psychology, and I think that was mostly ignored, possibly because of this sort of flow of popular, journalistic accounts of evolutionary psychology that were saying, like saying we have a Stone Age mind. And it's true in a deep sense that we have a Stone Age mind in modern conditions. However, we do have those modern conditions. They didn't come from nowhere. We did construct them. They were done by human beings. So that we must have the capacities, for example, to live in large-scale societies, to build coalitions of millions of people, to build technology that goes way beyond tool making, and so on and so forth. So we have to understand these things. And I think, in a way, the more we focus on these modern things, the more people will realize that an evolutionary perspective really makes sense. Because if I'm telling you that in small bands of foragers, the more forceful males had more opportunities to mate, then you may think, well, that's possibly true, but basically it's about a very faraway species that's closer to chimps, people think, than to us. And then, but if I tell you that no, modern ways of building nationalism, for example, or racial categories, or sex differences and sex roles and so on, are better explained in terms of those evolved preferences, then that's much more relevant and that's much more explanatory. So and it does emphasize difference as well as universal.
And so do you feel, we talked about this before off air, before we started, I think it's worth bringing it up now because it's a nice segue. So do you feel that the next sort of fertile frontier for evolutionary psychology is to take all of these wonderful explanatory principles that are only available via an evolutionary lens and use them in all of these practical applied domains? Of course, I use it in the context of consumer behavior and in the context of Darwinizing the business school. Randy Nesse uses it in evolutionary medicine. There's one or two guys that use it in the legal setting. So do you feel that this might be the next sort of big frontier for evolutionary thinking?
Yes, and it doesn't have to be based on a division between applied and basic science. I think it's very much part of the basic science. I've been trying to work on something. I recently finished a paper with a political scientist, Michael Peterson of Denmark, about our ideas of the economy. So everyone has ideas about the economy, this sort of, and the basis of lots of political debates. And what political scientists have been noticing is that it's not very easy to explain them as just effects of propaganda. So people have ideas that, for example, the markets are bad. For example, the markets are very exploitative. Markets are places where the weak get crushed by the powerful. Or people have ideas that regulation does what it's supposed to do. So when there's regulation to keep the prices low, the prices will stay low, and so on. Many of these ideas, economists would tell you, no, that's not exactly the way it works, or in many cases it's exactly the opposite of the way it actually works, and we have evidence for that, and so on. But no one really explains why people would have these ideas, why these ideas are popular. And one possible hypothesis, something that we're exploring, is whether that's people have these ideas because they correspond to models of fairness and transaction and social exchange that we developed over millions of years, and that form the basis of our idea of how you acquire goods and how you distribute goods. And if that's the case, then that would explain why some of these ideas are very, very salient and very compelling for people. Like, for example, the one set of ideas is that everything that makes markets efficient, in particular the fact that transactions are one-off, you can buy one thing and then that's the end of your interaction with that person, that they're fairly anonymous, you buy from lots of places. These days it's even more the case on the internet, and you have no idea where those people are or what they are, and so on and so forth. And finding that the transaction is not motivated by anything but the fact that people offer a good at a good price for you and you buy, and that's it. So these are characteristics that make market transactions very efficient on the aggregate, but they're also, I think, threat signals for a human mind, because we develop trade in the context of repeated exchange with personally known individuals. And the fact that we don't know anything about someone, there's a huge literature to show that, is interpreted as this threat signal. This person could be a defector. The fact that we're not going to repeat interaction means that they're not going to do us any favors. And what we want is, what we intuitively think social exchange is about, I think, is a repeated exchange of favors that are ultimately beneficial to both parties. But at each point in each transaction, it's not clear that you could clear the market, or you could clear the account. So what we're trying to say is that many ideas that people have about the modern economy are based on this intuitive notion of social exchange, for which there is psychological evidence, and that this explains the spread of some ideologies better than just the idea that people, economists would say, well, people have these ideas because they haven't studied economics. And I think, well, yes, but they could have random bad ideas, and they don't have random bad ideas. They have some sort of special sort of ideas about the economy. Or some social scientists would say, well, it's just because people listen to the propaganda from various actors. But actually, in political science, there's evidence that that's not really entirely the case, that you can, that people's intuitions are independent. So basically, people pay attention to politicians who say things that confirm their intuitive notions about the economy, rather than developing those intuitions because politicians told them about that. So we're trying to do that work, and the idea is exactly that we can understand a lot about the way people understand politics and the economy if we see it in evolutionary terms.
Sorry, two quick comments.
Yeah.
I've because you mentioned repeat interactions. I've referred to that exact idea when explaining why, for example, in traditional Arab society, you just shake hands and your word is your honor. Whereas if you're living in California, even the most banal of social interactions involves a 1,000-page contract for every possible contingency. And the reason is, and actually, and this is based on personal experience as somebody who, is from Lebanon, so I understand the Middle East, and someone who lived in Southern California. I was astonished when we first moved to Southern California. The size of our lease agreement when we rented our condo was slightly more complicated than the Camp David Accord between Egypt, Israel, and the United States. And, it was, in 1957, we might have used these pesticides, so you can't retroactively sue us. There might be a plane that, right? Well, the reason for that, I argued, again, using an evolutionary lens, very much in line with what you're saying about repeat interactions. Well, when you come from EEA type environments, the small tribal, coalitions of people, if I cheat and I renege on my word, I can only do it once and then I'm cooked. Therefore, we don't need a 600-page document. But in the context of the fly-by-night in California, today I'm here, tomorrow I'm in Atlanta, every banal interaction has to be regulated by the 600-page document, correct?
Yes, and I think the obviously the way we used to manage that in small-scale environments was through reputation and shaming. And it's actually a good thing and not so surprising from an evolutionary viewpoint that we are going back to reputation, and that lots of modern markets work on reputation, that you can't, sell on eBay without, you can cheat, as you say, but only once, and then your name is mud, and that's it. So we create these markets based on reputation, which try to go back to this sort of notion that you have to offer mutually beneficial arrangements, because otherwise that's very bad. Otherwise you will lose some good, which is your reputation. It's also the case that that this sort of application of this social exchange template could explain why, for example, people judge politicians on the basis of their or policies on the basis of intentions and the moral value of those intentions. If you have a policy that says we will give more money to poor people, it's almost impossible to say this is wrong, because there is an a priori sort of idea that anyone who's motivated to do that must have a good motivation, and therefore the results will be good. Now, this is where economists and political scientists say, well, yes, but sometimes giving money to people, or even people who deserve it, might be counterproductive for lots of reasons, and we have to think about that. These people are always, of course, intuitively they're seen as really evil and really sort of determined to take the bread out of the poor, starving orphan's mouth. However, and I think one reason for that is that And also another phenomenon is that we tend to think of policies in terms of the morality or the sort of moral qualities of the people who propose them, rather than their efficiency. And one reason for that is that in small-scale environments, that makes sense. That is, a deal that's offered by someone who's usually a good person is far more likely to be beneficial to you than a deal offered by a guy who's known to be a bit of a shyster. So so judging deals by the morality of the people involved with them is a pretty good strategy. In large-scale politics, it may not be. There may be, crooks who do a lot of good for their society for lots of bad reasons, but it so happens. And it's more difficult for us to judge it that way.
Right. One quick point, and then I just want to move to the last sort of set of questions. As I tell all my guests, because they're all fascinating, I could keep you here for another 5 hours, but I'm sure you're busy. E.O. Wilson famously said, and I hope I don't botch the phrase, he said, socialism/communism, wonderful system, wrong species. And so, I mean, that's one of my favorite quotes ever right now. Of course, as you know, but maybe some of our viewers don't, E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century, still alive, Harvard entomologist, studies social ants. Well, the natural system of social organization for the social ant is very different from that for humans. You've got the queen bee, the queen, not bee, the queen, the queen, and the queen ant, and then you've got everybody else is equal in the service of that queen, and hence, similarly, socialism/communism seeks to mimic that. But of course, we're not ants. So is that part of your work, in that you are trying to see whether there is a fit between the manner by which societies are organized, whether it be economically or politically, and whether these fit with certain fundamental principles of our human nature?
Well, not yet, because what we're trying to start with is to show that the way we think about societies is very much a product of the way we evolved in ancestral environments, and that this explains all sorts of interesting things about the way we think about societies. So we are not yet quite at the stage where we can actually provide our normative model of how you should organize society.
And of course, providing the normative model is where you get into trouble, as E.O. Wilson, right?
Yeah. So there's enough trouble as it is as things stand. But the thing is, it's also, when he said wrong species, it was a bit sort of misleading in a sense that, of course, as E.O. Wilson would know better than anyone else, what ants and bees have is not at all communism, because it's just a family. They're all kin. So it's a very different sort of thing. No, but there are elements of various political systems that I think speak to different kinds of evolved motivations. And of course, the idea of socialism is, not just socialism, but the idea of social welfare in general is based on something we can do and we're good at doing, which is communal sharing of resources. And that happens in all human societies, more or less, in more extensive or less extensive forms. It can be extended to lots of stuff or to just a few goods, but we all can do it. We know how to do that. There is a sense in which people deserving help, in a sense that through no fault of their own, they're in dire straits. There is a motivation to help them simply because it's a form of insurance. I mean, it's a form of reciprocation, expected reciprocation will justify that. And there's lots of policies that work on that. So in that sense, those policies are very much grounded in our evolved preferences. But also, and that's where the clash happens, there are also aspects of, for example, market transactions that are very clearly based on our evolved preferences, like the idea of private property, that the fact that you have worked on something makes you much more entitled to products of that thing than someone who hasn't. And this is something that we also find in lots of societies, that we find very early in children's notion of ownership and so on. And also, one thing that I find really interesting, if we look at the politics of small-scale societies, that if you want, the state of the art is that there is a motivation for power, especially in males, and especially in some males, because it's connected to mating success, and also because it's mating to all sorts of, it can be connected to all sorts of other advantages, but mating success might be the central factor. So there is a lust for power, as Nietzsche called it, and it is there. However, in lots of small-scale societies, you see that there is also powerful motivation in lots of people to take down the ones who are, a bit too, who overstep a little bit their authority. And so it seems that on the one hand, we have this motivation, at least in some people, to get into a position of power and extract all the advantages from that. And there is a certain tolerance of that as long as it sort of makes it possible to optimize certain tasks. So in small-scale societies, hunting expeditions have a leader because that's a coordination tool. However, once these people get a bit too big for their boots, there is a tendency to try and peg them down. Now, that, I think, is a very powerful human motivation. It's present in modern humans. It explains lots of political things, but it also explains the fact that humans are very good at putting together associations and organizations that do stuff through collective action. Right. Long before we had medical insurance from the state in Germany and in England, you had friendly societies that provided the same service on the basis of a mutual association. So it seems to me that there's a lust for power. There's also a lust for what I'd call sort of ancestral anarchism, sort of idea that the community can very well provide all sorts of things without central organizations. And these are sort of components of our modern political psychology. But it's, and I don't think that will ever lead us into our recommendation for how to organize society. Right. For two reasons. One is that it's scientifically not possible, and the other one is that who would listen to a bunch of evolutionary psychologists telling them how society should be organized? I mean, that's sort of ridiculous.
All right, last question, and then I'll ask you to promote any works that you'd like to that's not yet public. This is really targeted, well, I guess to anybody, but certainly to young professors who might be watching or doctoral students. How do you decide which research questions to work on next? So, for example, at one point you said, I worked on religion and I keep getting dragged back into it, kicking and screaming, but I've gone on to other things. How do you decide which new intellectual landscapes to go to? And a sort of a corollary to that question is the tension between, this is sort of a careerist question, between depth, you become the specialist in the evolutionary thing of religion versus you go to endless landscapes. You always go back to Jamaica because you love it versus you'd like to explore the whole world. Well, I've tended to be, before you answer my question, I've tended to be much more the latter, in that I'm very much of a purist. I don't give a damn about careerist things. I care about, life is short. I care about exploring as many intellectual landscapes. So if today Pascal Boyer decides he'd like us to work on a paper together and it has no value whatsoever to my career advancement, I couldn't give a damn, because if he excites me, then I'm on board. Now, of course, we may not want to be telling that our doctoral students, because they will ultimately have to operate within certain rules if they wish to go up the ladder and so on. So let's answer both questions. How do you decide which landscapes to go to, and are you a breadth or depth guy?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is that I must say that I've gone from one topic to another largely on the basis of really accidental sort of reasons, and interacting with people who happen to tell me about problems that they thought were interesting, and I thought, well, this is something to work on. For example, this stuff on ritualized behavior came from Pierre Liénard, who was, as an anthropologist, really interested in this, and I thought ritual, well, that's not super interesting, and then he convinced me that there was something to do there. more generally, that is a bad thing. And I must say to all these kids and young people, do not be someone like Gad just described himself. This is very bad. He seems to be prosperous,
but
happy.
who's sitting on top of the kingdom now, kids?
Exactly. That's not going to happen. I think, no, I think you have to start by being very much in depth, a specialist of one thing and one thing only. And it's. I must say, I envy the people who really have a specialism that's really narrow. Not just because, I mean, because it's epistemically very good that some people know everything there is to know about a certain segment of the universe. And I think it's a defect, it's a flaw of my character and perhaps yours, that to be able to be interested in various things. It sounds great when you say it, but actually it's not just bad for your career, but it might be bad sometimes in the sense that you don't do things well enough. And I think I regret a bit doing that. I used to date a woman whose father was one of the world's specialists in the latter Greek and Roman Platonist philosophers. They had little meetings with 40 people, and they were the only 40 in the world who did that. And they were super excited that one had found some passage that no one else knew that actually showed that they'd been wrong about something or other. I thought that was fantastic. There's a level of erudition and scholarship that I admire. And I think, some geniuses manage to do both. So, Darwin, that's an example, knew everything there was to know about sea snails and things like that. Was also a specialist of pigeons and their breeding and so on and so forth. And he explored these domains to extraordinary depth, and also had theoretical theoretical perspective, obviously. Bill Hamilton, who was a great biologist of the last century, and fantastic guy who's famous, in terms of mimetic descendants for clarifying the ideas of inclusive fitness and sort of solidarity in animal species. He also was a specialist of various little critters and knew everything there was to know about that. So the ideal is to be both, and there are heroes like Bill Hamilton or Darwin who do it, or E.O. Wilson, indeed. But
I will respectfully disagree on one part.
Okay.
That is that if you are a committed interdisciplinarian and one who goes into many intellectual landscapes, that necessarily implies that you somehow do things less well than others. I think that if you are a true purist, a true perfectionist, then whatever landscape you go into, you only will feel satisfied if you could get the check that I am now as good in talking about this topic as anybody else who is the snail guy. So in other words, so for example, in my case, I'm very, very careful that whenever someone asks me a question on a topic that I can't come with the full GAD confidence, I will simply say, frankly, I don't know enough about this topic. So in other words, there's an epistemic humility that makes me say, look, I just frankly don't know enough about this to speak with full confidence. But once I go into a new landscape and I then contribute to it, I will make sure to know enough about it so that I could speak to anybody who's in that field and do so with full confidence. So I think we can be both. And of course, I'm nowhere near E.O. Wilson or Hamilton or any of those guys. But I think, and I say this not to be defending you and I who are interdisciplinarians, but to actually, for the young people who are listening, you can be an interdisciplinary, because ultimately the big advances are going to happen at the nexus of fields. So I just don't want people to think that the only way to be successful in science is to be the snail guy. Yes, you are right. You need to be snail guy. But I think you also have to be sufficiently broad-minded that you could see connections between your work and others. That's where the big juice is going to come from.
Yes, but I think we may have been talking at cross purposes, because I wasn't talking about disciplines. I was talking about fields, and it seems to me that, for example, if you're, I think you should at least start by being a specialist of one problem. Like, why do people have obsessions and compulsions? That's a great problem. And if you're serious about that problem, you should not confine yourself to clinical psychology. You should also do neurophysiology. You should also do genetics and some evolutionary psychology, and maybe some anthropology to see how these things work out in different places. But that is intrinsically interdisciplinary, but it's focused on one problem.
Got it.
And it seems to me that a lot of what we do is interesting when it focuses on one problem, ignores disciplines, but does not ignore the fact that it's one question.
Yeah.
Do people really want to be in a small group of like-minded people against the universe? Yes or no? That's an interesting question about coalitional psychology. And if you want to understand it, you may have to do some hormones and behavior. You may have to do some neurophysiology, neuroimaging, sociology, and so on and so forth. So I'm entirely for crossing the disciplines. But all this is very bad advice. If you want a career in academia or science, you must be predictable, boring, and incredibly narrow.
Don't listen to him, guys. Don't listen to him. You could be a very serious scientist and fun. Hey, Richard Feynman. Are there many more famous scientists than Richard Feynman? The guy was a partier. So I want to eradicate the stereotype. Again, we were talking about stereotypes earlier, that you need to be this nerd. You could be a fun-loving, excited...
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So let's aspire to be Richard Feynman.
Okay, that's a good hope.
While never reaching his level, we could shoot to be Richard Feynman, yes?
That's a very good level. Yeah.
That would be good. Any projects or, things that you're working, not necessarily, the technical details of a paper, but any big things that you're working on, you're working on a next book or something that you'd like to promote prior to us ending this chat?
Yes, I want to promote a next book, which I just finished, or I'm almost, it's with a publisher, but I'm still trying to revise a few things, that will be called Minds Make Societies. And it's about all the problems of the social sciences that will be now become much clearer now that we see them in a cognitive evolutionary perspective. So it has chapters going through why do we have families the way we do, why do we have what is social justice and what do we mean by that, to why do we have religions and why is there, and can human beings understand large-scale societies at all or not? So that's the big book, but you will have to wait for a year before you buy it, because publishers are extremely slow and at getting stuff out. But you should definitely save money, because publishers are also expensive. Sometimes books are sometimes expensive. So
is this a book meant for the masses, or is this an academic technical book?
It's meant for the in-between crowd of enlightened. What it means is that it's what people call the educated readership. So if I tell you, here is a book about how lots of stuff that happens in societies and how it makes sense once we see it in the evolutionary lens. If you think that it's not for you, well, it's not for you. But if you read that kind of stuff, if you read those, other books that talk about stuff like that, then it certainly is for you. It's not academic in that sense. And also, going back to our discussion, it's about stuff that I am not a specialist of. I mean, there's a whole chapter on kinship and sex preferences and stuff like that I'm really not. But as you said, I try to do this at a level where I can, explain my chapter to someone like David Boss, and I'm not ashamed.
Who has been on my show. I will expect a signed copy of your next book to be arriving in the mail for me once it comes out.
Okay.
And then hopefully you'll come back. You'll be good enough to come back on the show to discuss it. An absolute pleasure. We've been going for almost 2 hours.
I know time
Isn't
flies
that
when
amazing? You
two idiots agree on these things. I mean,
and one idiot more than the other. A true honor to speak to you. I've been a fan of your work for many years. So thank you so much for coming on. Stay on the line. I will try to get this up on the channel as soon as possible. Thank you so much, Pascal.
great. Thank you very much.